History is full of wars that changed borders, toppled governments, and erased empires. But few conflicts reshaped the world as deeply and as unintentionally as Japan's invasion of China in 1937. Japan marched into China believing it could crush a weak, divided nation and eliminate the threats it feared most. 8 years later, Japan lay in ruins. But China did not emerge restored under its existing government. Instead, it emerged communist. The Chinese Communist Party, which had been on the brink of extinction before the invasion, walked out of the war stronger than ever and went on to seize total power just 4 years later. This was not supposed to happen. Japan despised communism and viewed it as a destabilizing force spreading across Asia. The invasion was meant to prevent that future, not create it. Yet, through a brutal combination of miscalculation, mass violence, and strategic blindness, Japan destroyed the one force that could have stopped Mao's rise while unintentionally protecting the one force that would ultimately rule China. This video unpacks the twisted chain of events that turned a foreign invasion into the decisive turning point of the Chinese Civil War. It explains how the war against Japan exhausted China's nationalist government, radicalized the countryside, and handed the communists everything they needed to win without fighting Japan head-on. What follows is not a story of clever ideology or inevitable revolution, but a case study in how war can produce outcomes no one planned, and how modern China was born from one of history's most catastrophic backfires. Before Japan invaded, China was already collapsing from within, and understanding this weakness is essential to understanding why the invasion changed everything. By the early 1930s, China was not a unified country, but a fractured battlefield ruled by warlords, corruption, and exhaustion. The Qing dynasty had fallen in 1911, but no stable system replaced it. Instead, regional strongmen carved the country into personal fiefdoms, each with private armies, tax systems, and loyalties that shifted with opportunity. Ordinary people paid the price. Peasants worked the land under constant threat of conscription, banditry, and famine, while generals fought endless wars that produced no future and no security. Out of this chaos emerged two rival visions for China's survival. On one side stood the nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who believed that only centralized authority, military discipline, and gradual modernization could reunify the country. On the other side was the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong, promising land reform, mass mobilization, and a revolutionary break from the old order. These two forces were not equals. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Chiang was winning decisively. His armies controlled China's major cities, railways, and industrial centers. Foreign powers recognized his government as legitimate. The communists, by contrast, were hunted relentlessly. Chiang viewed them not as political rivals, but as an existential disease, and his campaigns against them were ruthless. Communist cells were smashed in urban centers, suspected supporters executed, and entire villages punished for offering shelter. By the early 1930s, the communist movement was shrinking fast, bleeding fighters and territory with no clear path to victory. The situation reached its breaking point in 1934 when Chiang's forces encircled the remaining communist strongholds in southern China. Militarily, this should have been the end. Cut off, outgunned, and surrounded, the communists faced annihilation. Their escape, later mythologized as the Long March, was not a triumph at the time, but a desperate flight for survival that killed nearly 90% of those who attempted it. When the survivors finally reached the north, they were exhausted, starving, and politically marginal. Chiang believed the communist threat had been neutralized. He was wrong, but not because Mao had outsmarted him. The communists survived because history was about to intervene in the most violent way imaginable. Just as Chiang prepared to deliver the final blow, a far greater force entered the scene, one that would shatter the balance of power inside China and transform a dying insurgency into the future rulers of the country. Japan's invasion in 1937 didn't just start a foreign war, it detonated the internal balance of power inside China. What Tokyo saw as a clean military conquest instantly became the single greatest gift Mao's communists could have imagined. When Japanese forces crossed into China, they made one critical assumption: the real enemy was the nationalist government. The Kuomintang held the cities, the railways, the ports, the international recognition. To Japanese planners, crushing that state meant crushing China itself. The communists were dismissed as irrelevant peasants hiding in mountains, barely worth ammunition. That miscalculation changed history. As Japan launched full-scale war, Chiang Kai-shek had no strategic choice. As the recognized government of China, he had to defend the nation's major cities. Retreating without a fight would destroy his legitimacy overnight. So he committed his best-trained, best-equipped divisions to conventional warfare against one of the most modern armies on Earth. The Battle of Shanghai in 1937 became the turning point. For 3 months, Chiang's elite forces fought street by street, block by block, trying to prove China could stand as a sovereign nation. They were annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of his most experienced soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, losses that could never be replaced. Japan's advance toward Nanjing sealed the political damage. When the capital fell and mass atrocities followed, the shock reverberated far beyond the battlefield. To millions of ordinary Chinese, the nationalist government had failed its most basic duty: protection. It didn't matter that Chiang's armies fought bravely or that Japan's firepower was overwhelming. In moments of national trauma, perception outweighs reality. The government in Nanjing was seen as powerless, bleeding, and unable to shield its people from horror. Meanwhile, Mao's communists were nowhere near these disasters, and that absence was deliberate. Mao understood something Chiang did not. This war could not be won by standing toe-to-toe with Japan. Instead, communist forces melted into the countryside, avoiding decisive engagements, conserving manpower, and letting the nationalists absorb the full shock of invasion. While Chiang's soldiers died in cities, communist organizers moved village to village, embedding themselves among peasants displaced by Japanese terror. They didn't claim battlefield victories. They claimed moral ones. Every Japanese bombing raid that destroyed a city weakened Chiang. Every massacre that followed hardened rural resentment. And every month the war dragged on drained the nationalist state of men, money, and credibility. Japan thought it was destroying China's resistance. In reality, it was selectively demolishing the one force that could stop Mao after the war ended, while leaving the communists intact, growing quietly in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the exhausted victor would have nothing left to defend. While Japan was grinding down Chiang Kai-shek's armies on the front lines, it was also handing Mao something far more powerful than territory: legitimacy. Japanese brutality transformed the communists from a fringe insurgency into the emotional center of Chinese resistance. The atrocities were so widespread, so indiscriminate, that they rewired public loyalty at the grassroots level. Villages burned, families destroyed, entire communities erased, and in the aftermath, it was rarely the nationalist government that showed up. It was communist cadres arriving days later with food, basic medical aid, and a simple message. This happened because China was weak, divided, and ruled by elites who couldn't protect their own people. The communists didn't need to exaggerate Japanese crimes. Reality did the work for them. Massacres, scorched earth campaigns, forced labor, and biological warfare created a level of rage that demanded an explanation and an outlet. Mao framed the war not just as resistance against Japan, but as proof that China could never survive under the old system. Nationalist officials were portrayed as corrupt, distant, and compromised by foreign ties, while communist fighters were presented as sons of the soil, living among peasants, sharing their hunger, and fighting for national survival rather than personal power. In the countryside, where most Chinese lived, that narrative stuck. This shift happened quietly but decisively. While cities fell and headlines focused on major battles, the political war was being won far from cameras and diplomats. Communist influence spread through land reform promises, local militias, and political education that fused anti-Japanese hatred with revolutionary ideology. Every Japanese reprisal created new recruits. Every destroyed village became a recruitment poster. By the early 1940s, the communists were no longer just surviving. They were expanding, building parallel systems of governance that functioned beneath the chaos of war. Meanwhile, Chiang's government was collapsing from within. Inflation spiraled out of control as wartime spending crushed the economy. Corruption flourished as officials siphoned resources meant for soldiers and civilians. Nationalist troops went unpaid, unfed, and demoralized. Desertions increased. Loyalty eroded. In contrast, communist units emphasized discipline and cohesion, reinforcing the perception that they represented a new moral order. The longer the war lasted, the clearer the contrast became. Japan believed it was dismantling China piece by piece. What it actually dismantled was the only political force capable of preventing a communist takeover once the foreign enemy was gone. By the time the war neared its end, the communists weren't just an alternative. They were the only force that still looked intact, credible, and ready to claim the ruins left behind. When Japan surrendered in 1945, it should have been Chiang Kai-shek's moment of triumph. He had stood against one of the most powerful militaries in the world for 8 brutal years and survived. But victory exposed the truth Japan had engineered without realizing it. The nationalist state was hollow. Years of total war had drained its armies, shattered its economy, and burned away whatever loyalty remained among the population. Chiang's soldiers returned from the front exhausted, underpaid, and disillusioned, while inflation destroyed savings and corruption rotted confidence in the government. The war that was supposed to save China had left its ruling system on the brink of collapse. Mao, by contrast, emerged from the war stronger than he had ever been. Communist forces had avoided the grinding attrition of conventional battles and preserved their manpower. Even more critically, they now controlled vast rural territories and commanded the allegiance of millions who saw them as the true victors of resistance. When Japanese troops withdrew, they left behind enormous stockpiles of weapons and equipment. In the chaos of surrender, much of this arsenal flowed directly into communist hands, especially in Manchuria, where Soviet forces transferred captured Japanese arms to Mao's fighters. Overnight, a guerrilla movement became a modern army. The Chinese Civil War resumed almost immediately, but this time the balance of power had flipped. Chiang's forces were larger on paper, yet hollow in spirit. Units deserted or defected en masse, persuaded by communist agents who promised land, food, and an end to endless sacrifice. Soldiers who had fought Japan for nearly a decade were unwilling to die for a government they no longer trusted. Mao's forces, meanwhile, were unified, disciplined, and energized by a clear narrative. They had resisted foreign domination while the nationalists had failed. The final campaigns unfolded with brutal efficiency. Communist armies encircled cities, cut supply lines, and used political persuasion as much as firepower. Victory after victory accelerated the collapse of nationalist authority. By 1949, there was little left to defend. Chiang fled to Taiwan with the remnants of his government, while Mao entered Beijing not as a rebel leader, but as the architect of a new state. Japan had invaded China to destroy it. Instead, it had burned away the old order and cleared the path for a revolution that might never have succeeded without foreign invasion. The deepest irony is that Japan feared communism more than almost anything, yet its invasion created the conditions that made communism inevitable in China. Before 1937, Mao's movement was fragile, isolated, and on the verge of extinction. After 8 years of war, it emerged as the only force that looked disciplined, nationalist, and capable of restoring dignity. Japan did not convert China through ideology. It converted China through destruction. By demolishing the nationalist state's legitimacy, exhausting its armies, and traumatizing its population, Japan reshaped how millions of Chinese defined strength, justice, and survival. This transformation didn't happen because peasants suddenly embraced Marxist theory. It happened because the communists successfully tied their cause to national revival. Resistance became revolution. Revenge became reform. The communists framed their victory not as a class struggle imported from abroad, but as the final answer to foreign humiliation. In that story, Japan played the villain perfectly. Every atrocity reinforced the idea that China could only be safe under a system that was ruthless, unified, and uncompromising. The communists promised exactly that, and after years of chaos, many Chinese were willing to accept the cost. Japan also changed the international context in Mao's favor. The devastation of the war weakened Western influence in China and pushed global attention toward Europe's recovery. By the time the Civil War ended, the world was exhausted. Few were willing to re-enter China to stop a revolution that now looked organic and irreversible. What began as a regional invasion ended by reshaping the global balance of power, creating a communist state that would redefine the Cold War and challenge the United States for decades to come. History often turns on intention, but outcomes rarely obey it. Japan invaded China to dominate East Asia and prevent ideological threats from spreading. Instead, it destroyed the one force capable of stopping Mao, radicalized a population through suffering, and delivered a revolutionary movement into power. Modern China exists not in spite of that invasion, but because of it. The invasion did not defeat China. It remade it, and the consequences are still shaping the world today. Japan never set out to build communist China, yet it ended up doing exactly that. The invasion meant to crush a fractured nation instead unified it under the only force left standing when the smoke cleared. By focusing its firepower on China's official government, Japan shattered the nationalist state, drained its armies, and stripped it of legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. At the same time, Japanese brutality handed Mao the perfect enemy, the perfect narrative, and the time he needed to grow from a hunted insurgent into the leader of a victorious revolution. This is why history's biggest turning points are often accidents. Japan lost the war, but its deeper defeat was creating a political system it feared more than any battlefield enemy. Modern China, with its centralized power, nationalist ideology, and deep suspicion of foreign intervention, was forged in the trauma of that invasion. The shock waves didn't stop in 1949. They still shape East Asia, global politics, and the strategic rivalry defining the 21st century. The lesson is uncomfortable but clear. Wars don't just destroy enemies, they rewrite societies. Japan invaded China to control it. Instead, it transformed it. And the world we live in today is the result of that unintended consequence.